If you've ever caught yourself thinking something like, I think I'm just hard to love, it probably didn't come out dramatically. It's usually quieter than that. It might show up when someone pulls away a little and your mind fills in the blank before they say anything, or when a relationship ends and your first assumption is that you must have been too much somehow, too sensitive, too emotional, too complicated. And even when people care about you, there's sometimes a small voice in the background that wonders how long it will last. Not because you think you're a bad person, but because part of you believes that loving you probably takes more effort than loving most people. What's interesting is that people who feel this way rarely look difficult from the outside. They're often thoughtful, observant, careful with other people's feelings. They listen closely in conversations. They notice subtle shifts in tone. They replay moments in their head afterward, trying to understand if something went wrong. And that habit, paying attention to emotional details, is usually where this belief begins, because people who think they're hard to love tend to be very aware of how others react to them. They notice pauses, they notice hesitation, they notice when someone's energy changes even slightly. Most people miss those things, but someone who has learned to watch emotional signals closely doesn't. And over time, those small observations can start forming a story, not all at once, just slowly, quietly, in the background. A few relationships that felt uncertain, moments where affection felt inconsistent, situations where you opened up emotionally and the response felt distant, confused, or overwhelmed. None of these moments seem huge on their own, but the brain doesn't store experiences as isolated memories. It looks for patterns, and when similar emotional situations repeat often enough, the mind starts creating explanations, not necessarily accurate explanations, just explanations that feel consistent with what it has seen before. So eventually, the brain forms a simple rule. Maybe I'm just difficult to love. And once that rule exists, it quietly begins shaping how you interpret everything that happens afterward. For example, imagine someone takes a little longer than usual to respond to a message. Most people might assume they're busy, but someone who believes they're hard to love may immediately wonder if they said something wrong, not consciously trying to be negative. Their brain is simply searching for confirmation of the pattern it already expects. Psychologists sometimes call this rejection sensitivity. It's when the mind becomes highly alert to the possibility of emotional withdrawal, not because someone is dramatic or insecure by nature, but because earlier experiences trained the brain to treat subtle social signals as important information. The mind becomes very good at scanning for signs of distance, a shorter reply, a quieter tone, a slight change in enthusiasm. And when you're this aware of emotional shifts, it's easy to start feeling like you must be the cause of them. But here's something people rarely talk about. Many individuals who believe they're hard to love are actually people who learned very early to manage other people's emotional comfort. They become good listeners. They avoid creating conflict. They try not to ask for too much reassurance. In other words, they become careful, not because they naturally prefer silence, but because somewhere along the way they learned that emotional stability in relationships could disappear quickly. So they adapt, they monitor, they adjust, they try to be easy to be around. But the strange thing about emotional adaptation is that the more someone adapts to protect relationships, the more they can start feeling like their natural self must be a problem, because the version of them that people interact with most often is already edited, filtered, carefully measured. The real thoughts get softened, the real reactions get slowed down, the real feelings sometimes stay unspoken. And after doing that long enough, it can start to feel like the unfiltered version of you might be overwhelming. So the belief slowly grows. If people saw the full version of me, it would probably be harder for them. But here's where the psychology becomes more complicated, because the feeling of being hard to love isn't about being emotionally intense. It's about emotional unpredictability in earlier relationships. When someone grows up in an environment where affection feels stable and predictable, the brain learns a simple expectation: care is consistent, connection is safe. But when affection feels inconsistent, warm at times and distant at others, the mind starts trying to understand why. Children especially are wired to assume that relationship problems are connected to something about themselves. It's not a conscious thought, it's more like an emotional conclusion. If connection disappears sometimes, I must have something to do with it. That conclusion can stay surprisingly quiet. but it becomes part of how someone understands themselves. And as they grow older, it starts showing up in subtle behaviors. They apologize quickly, even when situations are ambiguous. They hesitate before expressing needs. They think carefully about whether they might be asking for too much. They sometimes assume they're the complicated one in relationships before anyone else even suggests it. And here is where it gets interesting, because people who believe they're hard to love often become extremely easy to love in certain ways. They're attentive, they're patient, they try to understand other people's emotional worlds, but internally, they're carrying a different narrative. They feel like the emotional balance of a relationship depends on them being manageable, which means they often tolerate things that others wouldn't. Emotional distance, mixed signals, situations where their needs remain unclear or unspoken, because part of them believes that expecting too much might confirm the fear they already have, that loving them might feel like work. And this creates a strange psychological loop. The person quietly adapts to relationships where their emotional depth isn't fully understood.
Then when those relationships feel unbalanced, they interpret the outcome as proof that they were difficult to love, not realizing the pattern wasn't about difficulty. It was about compatibility. But here's where the deeper layer appears, and it's something many people never fully recognize about themselves. People who believe they are hard to love are often extremely aware of emotional nuance. They notice small shifts in behavior. They sense when something is off even before it's explained. They think deeply about what others might be feeling. In psychology, this kind of emotional awareness is sometimes linked to high interpersonal sensitivity. It means someone is tuned in to social signals that most people move past quickly. And while this awareness can create overthinking at times, it also creates empathy. It allows someone to understand complex emotional situations. It helps them read between the lines in conversations. It makes them careful with people's feelings. None of that is emotional difficulty. It's emotional depth. But emotional depth doesn't always feel comfortable in environments that prioritize simplicity. Some relationships operate on quick reassurance and surface-level communication. Others involve deeper reflection and emotional processing. When someone with high emotional awareness interacts with someone who processes emotions more simply, misunderstandings can happen. One person may feel like they're asking reasonable questions. The other might feel like the conversation is becoming heavy. And when this mismatch happens repeatedly, the person who feels deeply may begin assuming they're the complicated one. But the real issue is rarely complexity itself, it's alignment. Some people communicate in short emotional sentences. Others communicate in long paragraphs. Neither style is wrong. But when those styles don't meet in the middle, both people can leave the interaction feeling misunderstood. And if someone already carries the belief that they're hard to love, they'll usually place the responsibility on themselves. They'll assume they asked for too much, or felt too much, or needed too much clarity. But here's the quiet truth that shifts the entire pattern. Most people aren't actually hard to love. They're just used to relationships where their emotional language wasn't fully recognized. And when emotional languages don't match, love starts to feel confusing. Not impossible, just misinterpreted. The mind doesn't always recognize this difference. It simplifies the story. Relationships feel difficult. Therefore, I must be difficult. But relationships are rarely that simple. They are shaped by personality differences, communication habits, emotional timing, personal history, and the unspoken expectations each person brings with them. Sometimes two people care about each other, but process emotions in completely different ways. One prefers reassurance through conversation. The other prefers reassurance through actions. One thinks through feelings slowly. The other wants emotional clarity immediately.
None of these differences make someone harder to love. They simply make relationships more complex. And complexity isn't a flaw. It's just variation in how people experience connection. But when someone has spent years quietly believing they require extra patience, they often miss an important piece of their own story. They notice every moment someone struggles to understand them, but they rarely notice how much emotional insight they bring into the lives of others, the way they listen carefully, the way they notice when someone is pretending to be okay, the way they remember details other people overlook. These are not signs of someone who is difficult to care about. They are signs of someone who experiences relationships with unusual awareness. And awareness can feel heavy when it isn't shared, because being emotionally observant in a space where others aren't looking as closely can feel isolating. You start noticing patterns other people don't mention. You start asking questions others avoid. And eventually, you begin wondering if your emotional awareness itself might be the problem. But it usually isn't. It's simply a trait that needs the right kind of relational environment to feel natural. The belief that someone is hard to love often says less about who they are and more about the relationships where that belief first formed. The brain tries to create stable explanations for confusing emotional experiences, so it builds identities around them. But identities built from incomplete patterns can feel incredibly convincing while still being incomplete stories. And once you start noticing that pattern, how certain beliefs about yourself quietly formed from repeated emotional experiences, something interesting happens. You begin to see that the feeling wasn't random. It wasn't a personality flaw. It was a conclusion your mind reached while trying to understand connection. Once you see that, the belief loses some of its certainty because the pattern becomes visible. And when patterns become visible, they stop feeling like permanent truths. They start looking more like interpretations that were shaped by earlier environments. People who think they're hard to love usually aren't carrying some hidden defect. They're carrying emotional awareness shaped by experiences that made relationships feel uncertain. And when you understand that, something shifts, not dramatically, just quietly. The story begins to look different because the question slowly changes from "what's wrong with me?" to something much more accurate. What kind of connection actually understands the way I experience relationships? Once you see that difference, you can't really unsee it, and that awareness alone changes how you understand yourself. If this explains something you've quietly noticed in your own behavior, there's always more to uncover. Understanding human patterns, especially your own, is where that process begins.